Hey everybody, so welcome back to biology. Now we're starting the next unit about transcription and translation, and when we put those things together, it's called protein synthesis. This is the first bit. We're going to get you led up to the activity for today. So in this set, we start first with some recall here. Remember from the end of last unit, the structure of DNA. DNA is two strands. We've got the one strand on the one side here with adenine and guanine, and the phosphate is attached to the ribose or deoxyribose, which is attached to the next phosphate, attached to the next sugar, and the next phosphate, and the next sugar. And that chain continues, and it continues for billions of bases in human DNA. Meanwhile, the other half of the ladder, the other side of that double helix, goes in the opposite direction and is bonded to the first with hydrogen bonds. Those hydrogen bonds are really, really important. So remember that. Then, just remember the basic structure. We kind of usually look at images of DNA kind of like there on the left, and this would be a more detailed image on the right, again showing the hydrogen bonds in between the bases of DNA. Also shows the phosphate and sugar backbone structure that the first image doesn't. So now I want you to answer this question. Just write it in your notes, maybe write the question, and then write your answer below it if you can. And if you don't know the answer, still write the question and then just put a star next to that question. What is the function of DNA? So, how can DNA possibly do so much? DNA is a huge book of information. A huge book of information. In fact, I have the book of information right here. Now, this is book 1 of 26 for chromosome 1, or book 1 of 340 for all of your DNA. It's a huge amount of code inside of each and every one of our cells. That code looks like this. It's a bunch of A's, C's, T's, and G's. That's all it is. Now that code, you know from last unit, DNA, the nucleus is the control center for the cell, and DNA is the list of instructions that tell that control center what to do, how to direct the rest of the cell. How? How can DNA, something so tiny, do so much? That is the central dogma of molecular biology. So, a dogma is just a set of principles or rules laid down by an authority as truth. Okay, so here the central dogma of molecular biology states that DNA contains the instructions for making a protein. Okay, and those instructions in DNA are copied by RNA. To summarize even further, DNA codes for RNA, which codes for protein. So, what is a protein? Proteins are pretty amazing little molecular machines, and proteins are the things inside of our cells that can do work. Proteins are large, complex molecules that play many roles in our bodies or in a single cell and in biology in general. They do most of the work inside of cells. Inside of our cells, you saw all the organelles in last unit. There are no micromuscles or anything like that. The work is done by proteins. Proteins do most of the work, and they also build much of the structure and regulate a lot of different things in our bodies and in cells. Proteins are just one of the 4 types of macromolecules, which you might remember these are biological polymers, and proteins are made up of small subunits called amino acids. So, what are all those amazing things proteins can do? Well, we've got enzymes that catalyze chemical reactions. We've got structural proteins like collagen and elastin and keratin that build parts of our body, but also parts of all kinds of other all kinds of other living things, right? We've got motility proteins like actin and myosin and tubulin. Actin and myosin, for example, these are the primary movers that actually do your muscle contraction. There's regulatory proteins that bind to DNA, switch genes on or off. Storage proteins do just that. They store things. Hormonal proteins, insulin, nerve growth factor, many other hormones in your body actually are proteins. Receptors, hormone and neurotransmitter receptors, these detect oftentimes hormones or other neurotransmitters that change the way our bodies do things. Transport proteins carry small molecules or iron. Really important one inside of your blood called hemoglobin is a protein that transports little bits of oxygen. It grabs onto the oxygen when your blood passes through your lungs, grabs onto oxygen and carries it with it to wherever it needs to go. There's also some really cool special purpose proteins like the proteins that cause some types of algae to glow green or blue in some cases. So I want you to think about this. That protein is coded by RNA. This is what RNA looks like. So think about what you remember of DNA. Even go back to the beginning of this video. What do you remember about DNA, and what is similar or different to this RNA molecule? Okay. Hopefully, here again, write these in your notes. What is different and what is similar to the DNA molecule that we learned about in the last unit? Pause here if you haven't written those out yet. So the differences between RNA and DNA, first, RNA is just a single helix. It's a single strand. Second, maybe also equally obvious, we don't have a base thymine. No longer exists in RNA, and we use a base called uracil instead. Okay, that means in RNA, C pairs with G and A pairs with U. Okay, C, G, A, and U are the nucleobases. It's a single strand, right? And DNA uses a sugar called deoxyribose. And in RNA, that sugar is just ribose. Just a few of the simplest differences there. And that is where we leave off with the notes.